Our speaker this morning is Kevin Miller, and this past week has been very difficult for Kevin. His brother-in-law, Denny Troyer of Shipshewana, had a fatal heart attack. I claim him as my son-in-law, and Sojourners, who also attend CMC, know him as a frequent song leader. He also sings tenor in the Open Fifths Choir. He is a leader in our Stephen Ministry program. He has a nursing degree from Goshen College and a master's in public health from Johns Hopkins. In the early years of their marriage, he and Becky decided she would be free to pursue a career in international nutrition, and he would always be available locally to parent their two children, Lydia and Gabe. When he got restless hands, he envisioned improvements and did part of the work himself for their homes in Baltimore, Maryland, Ithaca, New York, and Goshen. Currently, he is working half-time in development for Goshen College with major donors. During COVID, he was head of a task force to test, sometimes isolate, and help the Goshen campus cope with this virus. He has lived abroad in Indonesia, Tanzania, and became fluent enough to converse in Indonesian and Swahili. Kevin's thoughts are like his pickleball serves, deep and landing well. He will speak on his spiritual journey, including insights gained from workshops with Father Richard Rohr of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you, Vic. It's good to be with you this morning. And on the note of my brother-in-law's passing this week, I just want to say how impressive it is when there's a community of faith, family and church friends who can gather around and lend support. My sister over in Shipshewana has been well supported, and there were even folks from this congregation who happened to be over there that might have known Denny Troyer. So thank you for that. We had very good family visiting times this week, but it reinforced for me the value of a faith community. So that's what you keep doing here every Sunday when you show up and in between Sundays. Okay, so men's spiritual growth. It feels a little strange to me to talk to a class of very wise people about spiritual growth, but I'm going to share it anyway, and we'll have time at the end to hear from all of you. So we start by saying, well, what is spiritual growth? And everyone in this room has pursued spiritual growth. The way I'm going to think about it this morning is spiritual growth is that journey to finding your true self. Discerning what is my contribution to making the world a better place. How are we open to the leading of the Spirit and seeing the divine in others as well as within ourselves. This is not always an easy journey because our ego gets in the way. I'm going to be referencing a lot of the wisdom of Richard Rohr this morning. He says, the way up is the way down. And you'll see what that means in a bit. Okay, what about men's spiritual growth? For the most part, men's spiritual growth is just like women's spiritual growth. And yet, when I'm doing this kind of work in a circle of other men, it does feel very different than if I'm in a mixed group. And there are some aspects of men's spiritual growth would be unique, and that's because culturally we all immerse ourselves in a society that has certain expectations for who men are and who women are. So there would also be, you'd probably enjoy hearing from somebody who wanted to speak about women's spiritual growth. We are all products of our culture and the family systems that we were raised in. As we grow, we become more aware of how we are individually distinct from others, but also how we're the same, how we're part of everything around us. So this is a picture of my family when I was growing up in Southern Colorado. I'm the one seated on the fireplace hearth, the second of 6 children and the oldest boy. So the 4 boys didn't realize that we were being privileged, especially by my dad. But as we grew older, we started hearing that from our sisters. It's one of those examples of how you can sometimes live within a privilege and you don't know it until someone else tells you. And that's part of your growth. Because I was the oldest boy, I had some of these oldest child responsibilities. We took things seriously. I like to tell other people what to do. But I realized after a while, my sister didn't really appreciate me being the oldest. She wanted to be the oldest. So again, by the time some of us were getting married and you'd bring in-laws into the family system, then you learned even more because they'd say, oh, when you're around your family, you behave very differently. So that's been helpful. My parents modeled important lessons for me about respecting and valuing others, regardless of who they are. In my early years, they probably thought they were also modeling the traditional division between male authority and female submission. I observed that they seemed to be working on decisions together, having conversation back and forth. But when I asked Mom about it, she said, well, we talk it over, but Dad makes the final decision. And that reminded me of this rather humorous little anecdote from Richard Rohr. I read somewhere, when asked who makes the decisions in his family, a man replied that his wife makes all the little decisions and lets him make the big ones. Pressed to clarify what he meant by that, he said, well, my wife decides what neighborhood we should live in, what schools are best for the children, how to budget our money, where we should go on vacation, who we socialize with, things like that. But I decide the big issues, like whether we should trust the Russians, whether the government is doing a good job, what we should do about the economy. I think that was happening some in my family too. They thought they were following some traditional expectation, but really I saw that they were quite evenly balanced. While I was attending Goshen College, I was an active member of Assembly Mennonite Church, and that's where I first got to know Donna. And we loved attending that church because it was so new and a fresh approach to church. And this was during the time when women's liberation and egalitarian ways of thinking were coming into the fore. Becky and I began dating while we were both attending Assembly Mennonite, and we both valued equal weighing of one's gifts and growing together in that way. She learned that I was a pre-med major, and she said, oh, I'm not so sure about that. It might hamper my career opportunities. And I said, well, I'm interested in healthcare. I'll go into nursing. And now since then I've learned you could be a flexible doctor too. But I got what she meant, and I was willing to change my major to nursing at that point. Now, of course, since then, her career has been the one that sometimes limits me, but it doesn't really limit me. And when we got married, she opted to keep her name Stoltzfus because Miller was kind of boring. Now, my parents eventually accepted that, okay, but my mom did say, you know, when I got married, I was very happy to take the name Miller. The next significant step in my spiritual growth came in 1991. So by now we were married about 8 years. We were living in Ithaca, New York, and Becky was in grad school, and we were part of a small church fellowship. And in our small group, we had heard about these cassette tapes that Richard Rohr had done teaching the Enneagram. And that was new to us. It was new to a lot of people in the early 90s. So our small group sat down and we started working through the Enneagram. I'm not going to teach you about the Enneagram now, but what you can see about it is that there are 9 different ways of being, at least 9. And that in itself was the first lesson for me, because I knew the right way to be and the right thing to do. And I felt like my job most of the time was to help others know the right thing to do. Becky was really glad for me to see there could be 9 ways of viewing something, all leave out. The Enneagram helped me to understand that when I push my strengths and skills too far, it becomes a pitfall or even destructive. I lived for decades thinking that my perfectionism was a great thing. I worked hard. I lived by a strong set of ethics and personal morality. I cared a lot about societal injustices, and I was committed to making the world a better place, and I still am today. But I learned that perfectionism comes at a great cost. All that analyzing, sorting, critiquing, figuring out good, bad, right, wrong, trying to convince others of your right position, it is hard, exhausting work. And I would say I also learned that perfectionism is almost always paired with judgmentalism. That when I think about trying to make the world a better place, I'm going to extend that to the people I love. But maybe they don't want me to make them into better people. It was just so confusing. I could see clearly what they needed to do. And eventually I even realized that the biggest target of my perfectionist judgmentalism was myself. So much of my striving was to gain a sense of worthiness, to be loved and accepted by my parents, by those around me, and by God. Growing up in the Mennonite church, I'm guessing there would be others of you who could relate to that too. And I'm grateful today that we do talk more about grace and we try to separate your behavior from being worthy and loved. My parents loved me a great deal, but I really had a strong attachment to feeling like I had to perform. I had to do. I had to be a certain kind of way in order to be loved and accepted. It took me, I would say, a good 25 years to really grapple with the depth of that kind of truth about who I was and my perfectionism. And as Richard Rohr started us on this journey way back in the early 90s, I continued reading some of his books more recently, and I have found them to be really helpful. Falling Upward is a book that describes the 2 halves of life. And in a way sets us up for the true self, false self kind of thing that gets talked about in Immortal Diamond. But if you think about, and this has been really helpful from Richard Rohr, if you think about your true self as being really where you want to be headed, you don't need to think about the false self as being bad. It's just not enough. It's where you get started, but you want to go beyond that. So the first half of life in Falling Upward, the way he describes that, We are naturally and rightly preoccupied with establishing our identity, figuring out what our strengths are, climbing, achieving, performing. But those concerns will not serve us well as we grow older and begin to embark on a further journey that also involves challenges, mistakes, loss of control, broader horizons, and necessary suffering that actually shocks us out of our prior comfort zone. Eventually, we need to see ourselves in a different and more life-giving way. The second half of life, then, is about what's the content that you're going to fill inside this container that you've built in your first half of life. So that all that building up and trying to figure out who you are, that applies to men and women, but men especially think about that a lot. Their identity is what they do. And again, that's been true for women as well. The second book, Immortal Diamond, in fact, the subtitle is Searching for Our True Self. He goes into more depth in that book, talking about how what this work is learning to acknowledge that your ego wants to play a role in how you're living your life, but that's not who you are. Who you are is deeper than that. And that in order to be transformed into truly who we are meant to be, we have to be willing to die to the old self and be born again. I mean, this is what Madeline was telling us about this morning. Baptism, in fact, it was helpful to hear her talk about baptism this morning. And I realized for the first time that if full immersion baptism is like being born again, coming out of that wet, warm womb into a new life. So yeah, you can't go back into the mother's womb, but you could be baptized. But the other value of baptism is that idea that you are dying to the old way. And this is one of the messages of spiritual growth. You have to, and it happens repeatedly. We see this in nature every year, the cycling. We have to die in the fall in order for something new to come forth. And you all have lived long enough that you've actually experienced that, many small deaths along the way before you actually die. And that some of those small deaths along the way is what actually leads to something new being born. In the years before we moved here to Goshen, we were 15 years in Ithaca, New York, and there was a spiritual growth program there called Hidden Treasure. And Hidden Treasure is another name for true self, or the inner diamond that Richard Rohr talks about, Immortal Diamond. This program consisted of a cohort of 15 to 20 people, and you would be together for weekend retreats 5 times a year over 3 years. It was led by a spiritual director who also had been a professor at Ithaca College in spiritual, in religious studies. She didn't speak just from a Christian perspective. She knew Buddhism and other ancient wisdom teachings. Topics that we might have covered in these classes were, she included the Enneagram, so that was popping up again. We did work on discovering and parenting our inner child, because many of us, when we were children, suffered from lack of attention, or actually there's a lot of pain and abuse too in the world. And I heard a lot of that sitting around the circle to realize what a challenging upbringing many people have. Wrestling with your inner critic. And believe me, I had a really good inner critic. And we spent a good deal of time talking about character defenses, which are things, patterns of behavior that we do to protect us, to help us be safe from the traumas of the world. Now, the problem is those traumas were usually long ago in our past, and we needed that kind of defensive reaction at the time to keep us safe. But somehow we keep it with us, and we're still operating out of those defenses as an adult when it's no longer needed. So that was some of the kinds of work that happened there. This is a bit of a picture of the big circular room where we would meet, and looked out onto nature. It was a beautiful place to do some of this kind of difficult work. By the third year of that program, I had a major breakthrough with my inner critic. I came to peace with my inner critic, and this is going to be a brief story. It took longer than this, but essentially what I did was I thanked it for its service to me on my behalf, and I gave it a new job. I said, I want you to be my honest witness. Help me to see what is, but without the judgmentalism that goes along with the critic. And I had a good feeling about it that weekend, but I thought, man, is this going to last? And it is lasting. It has been so helpful to me to, I mean, I sometimes still get critical, but for the most part, I feel like I can now simply notice, because we do have to discern. We see a situation, we have to think about, what am I going to do here? Well, you can still do that careful discernment work without immediately jumping to, ooh, that's good, that's bad, this and go, and judging it, and judging the people around it, and judging yourself. That part I can let go. And I've learned since then that this this whole thing that I went through is called retiring your loyal soldier. It comes from the end of World War II, when Japanese soldiers who were scattered around small islands in the Pacific Ocean went months or even years without realizing the war was over. They eventually were picked up, brought back to the mainland, and had a terrible time reintegrating until people around them realized, oh, we need to thank you for your service, but the war is over. And here's a new job that we need you to do for us. And you can come back into society and be helpful again, but now in a new way. So this, for me, that journey of the inner critic, the war is over. I don't need to do that anymore. I am loved and accepted. So I don't have to be beating up on myself all the time. One thing that bothered me about the Hidden Treasure program, and it wasn't the program itself. There were 18 people in my cohort, and I was one of 3 men. And one of them dropped out partway through. So, where are the men? Why aren't more guys interested in this work? It just baffled me. And it actually helped when I came here to Goshen and I saw, wow, men are still coming to church. Good for you. That doesn't mean you've got it all figured out yet. That's why we come. But yeah, there's need for men to do this kind of deep work. We think we've got it all figured out, but we don't. And the women don't have it all figured out either. There's been a lot of growth in the women's movements over time. Early on, I think women thought, we need that power that the men had been experiencing, and they took it, and then they were just as bad managers as the men were. So women have needed that kind of deeper growth too, to realize that there are healthy ways to exercise authority and power that is not part of patriarchy. The other thing I learned about the time that we transitioned here was that Richard Rohr has done a lot of work in men's spiritual growth, and there have been movements about it. Those books I had shared earlier are for everybody. He also has some books specifically talking to men. And I just want to read a couple of lines here about what might a masculine spirituality look like. It encourages men to take the radical gospel journey from their own unique beginning point in their own unique style with their own unique goals, which is what we end up doing anyway. But now, with no doubt or apology or need to imitate our sisters or even our fathers, this takes immense courage and self-possession. Such a man has life for others and knows it. He does not need to push, intimidate, or play the power games common to other men, because he possesses his power with surety and calm self-confidence. He's not opinionated or arrogant, but he knows. He is not needy of status symbols because he draws his identity from God and from within. He does not need monogrammed briefcases and underwear. I've never had monogram. He possesses his soul and does not give it lightly to corporations, armies, nation states, or the acceptable collective thinking. He is beyond red state, blue state thinking. Some of Richard Rohr's work has evolved into an organization called Illumen. And I love the title, Illumen. This is a nonprofit organization separate from Richard Rohr's Center for Action and Contemplation in Albuquerque. And Rohr wanted to have this group get started because he didn't want all his men's work to be dependent on him. And that's good actual maturity to think about succession planning. How are you going to pass on this to others? Illumin has chapters all across the country. There's an Indiana, Michigan chapter, and Jamie Bontrager Singer was one of the elders leading our chapter here locally. So there have been Mennonite men from our area that participate with Illumin. Let me just read you a few identity statements from the Illumin website. We are men transforming men through a power greater than ourselves. We are seeking a life-changing spirituality. We are focused on inner work that makes a difference in the world. We are fed by the wisdom traditions of forgiveness and radical inclusivity. We recover traditional patterns of male initiation. We affirm a masculine path to healing that reveals the true and false selves and honors the path of consent. We do this through the power of nature, ritual, image, story, and counsel. And you can just imagine nature. I mean, we all connect with nature in a profound way. One of the things Illumin has helped me be reminded of is that we are not separate from nature. I'm not going to go out and walk in nature. We are part of nature. And the more we can own that, the better the planet's going to be, because if we're doing things that are hurting the planet, we can immediately see this is hurting me. This is hurting all of us. The use of ritual, image, story, these are things that can be new to men or foreign to men, but they're often non-rational ways of conveying truth. And that's their power, is because we can set aside our head critical thinking all the time and just let something approach us in a new way. One of the signature elements of Illumin and men's work here is called the men's rite of passage experience. It's a 5-day retreat somewhere out in nature. I did mine in September of 2017 out in Colorado. I was born and raised in Colorado. I wanted to go back there and experience some rebirth. The men's rite of passage is, and I'll just read from the slide here, personal discovery about masculine spirituality and the Holy Mystery, a time to savor the healing and awesome power of nature, a process to address issues of loss, grief, and relationships, an opportunity to examine life's priorities and ask courageous questions, an invitation to listen to the voice of God, and a chance to return back to our lives with renewed commitment to using our gifts in new ways. The structure of the MROP, the Rite of Passage Week, lets men who participate in that grapple with 5 essential truths. Again, these would be true for women as well as men, but they hit men in a particular way. And at their core, they're helping us find our true self and separate a bit from our false self of ego-driven illusions of success. Life is hard. You are not that important. Your life is not about you. You are not in control. You are going to die. You think, wow, what a bummer of a week. But the way up is the way down. First, we have to let go. And they're not that far off from a lot of Jesus's teachings. The first shall be last. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, where's its life? You must be born again. There's also an annual conference that Illumin sponsors, Soul Rise, and I attended that this last November. This particular one was held near Bernalillo, New Mexico. Those are the Sandia Mountains. They're in the distance, and down a bit away from this picture is the Rio Grande River and cottonwood trees in fall leaf change. All of these Illumin Solarize events bring about 300 men together. And that's pretty awesome, actually, to be in a group with 300 other guys that are doing this kind of work, struggling together. We always start with drumming. I'm going to put that on mute. It's just a few seconds. So you're always encouraged. You're encouraged to bring a drum along if you've got one and join in, and they'll have a few extras there. Now, mostly you see a lot of old white guys here too. They're working really hard to invite men of color and younger men too. And in some of the chapter sessions here in Indiana, Michigan, we've got a session for fathers and sons to do a drum making exercise, because you really want to be doing this work with young boys and men as we're raising them up to be healthy men today. One of the core practices at the Solarize retreats and also when we gather locally is what's called council circles. These would be groups of about 8 men in a circle together. And here in this room, you can see all of us are in there, each in our own council circle. And the circle allows us to speak to a particular topic that is chosen and given to us. It's a prompt. But there are 4 intentions of how we are present with each other in the council circle. We're going to listen from our heart. And there's usually a talking stick. So if you don't have that stick, then you're just listening. We're speaking from the heart, meaning truthful to who we are. We're spontaneous and authentic. And by spontaneous here, it means don't rehearse a lot of and give a lot of thought ahead of time to how you're going to present this so beautifully to people in front of you. You're going to say what comes up, get it out there, and be lean of expression. I love this one because you want to get to the point. You don't need a whole lot of backstory to explain everything and to justify yourself before you confess what you're really trying to share. That's kind of how it works. It's not a conversation. It's taking turns, listening carefully to each other and listening to ourselves and saying it out loud in front of these brothers that we're gathered with. This was a picture of the mat in the center of the circle that I was part of. So there's a talking stick. There might be some elements from nature. It depends a little bit on what topics you're covering that time. And this was my group of buddies that we probably gathered in council circle 4 or 5 times over the 3 days of retreat. And one of them is holding a sign that says Gandhi. When we came in and registered, we got our name tags, and on the back had a name of some. This year, they were all spiritual wisdom teachers through the ages. And mine said Gandhi. So when we did our first council circle sit, I went in to find where's the circle of Gandhi. And that was how we selected where we were going to sit. This is Richard Rohr sitting on stage in the center of the circle there. He's getting old. Not as old as you folks are. He's becoming ill. He's been fighting cancer, and many of us wondered if this might be the last time we get to see him. He always comes for one evening of this retreat and cheers us on and gives us a little teaching. And it's been less and less over the years as this work has been carried on by many other people. But he had such a good time sharing with us that he visited the Pope Francis at the Vatican last summer. A wealthy donor who had a private jet said, "You need to go see Pope Francis. I'll make sure we get you an audience." And it worked out. So he flew to Rome, and he just enjoyed telling us this story of being ushered in through the Vatican for his audience with the Pope, and how the Swiss guards were on either side, and Richard kept trying to have conversation with them, and they kept not saying anything. And later he learned that they are never to engage with people coming through. But of course, Rohr thought this was great. He just wanted to talk to everybody. Yeah. He finally got in there to see Pope Francis, and he said, and there he was, and he wasn't that big. He had 45 minutes chatting with him, and he was kind of proud to tell us that Francis told him a couple of times, keep doing what you're doing. Wow. And this is significant for Richard Rohr because he is not loved by all the Catholic Church, by many, but not all, because his spirituality has moved beyond the rigid traditions. One last picture here. The theme of our retreat this last time was taken from some teaching by Joanna Macy. So I wanted to say that to let you know that we as men know that we can learn from women. and usually we learn an awful lot. Joanna Macy is known for the work that reconnects, and I'm going to read it from the screen here. There's a spiral of action that we, or of movement that we go through. There's gratitude, there's honoring our pain for the world, seeing with new eyes, going forth and doing something about it. And then you continue around, but on another level. You're always exercising gratitude, honoring the pain and the brokenness of the world, seeing something new in what I have just been observing, and then going forth and doing something about it, and then going around, just continuing that work. So we use that structure as part of the way we focused our work together that weekend. I'm going to end with one thing. There are a bunch of flat little rocks you see in the centerpiece there. We were invited each to take one. And when we got to our council circles, there were Sharpies there, and we could write the name that we wanted to be known by going forth from the retreat. I trusted my inner voice there, and I wrote down elder. And what I meant by that was I'm going to live into being ready to talk about this work, sharing it with others, with other men, with younger men, inviting them in to join me in this work, because it's a journey. I'm certainly not arrived. So I'm happy to join all of you now as elders here too. Okay, I'm going to stop there and give you a chance to pop any questions that you want to. We are approaching quarter till, and I don't know how strictly you finish at quarter till. You want to take 5 minutes for questions?
Take 5 minutes.
John?
What does it mean to you to honor our pain for the world?
I think what I was hearing there is we're recognizing that it's there, and especially who are the people being impacted by it. It doesn't mean honor in a way of supporting it or reinforcing it. It's recognizing it. I think that's the honoring of it. Many times, I mean, you've experienced this if you've been in a big city recently and there's homelessness, and the temptation is to not see it because I don't know how to solve that problem. It's too big. So I'm going to walk by on the other side. Honoring it, honoring that pain would be seeing it, and then maybe even thinking about or researching a little bit about what might be happening in this city about how they're addressing homelessness. And is there anything in that for me to participate in? It doesn't mean there is, but it's trying not to ignore the brokenness in the world. It's probably also connected to acknowledging our privilege. Because we can go by a lot of things and not realize there's struggle out there because things are good for me. Everything's fine.
Thank you, Kevin. It really was very, very, very helpful to hear that. I read Richard Rohr's column online every day. I usually read the one that comes about Saturday that you get all the week together. And I was really impressed last week that his subject that either Richard Rohr writes or people write for him on right now, I'm not sure which. It was talking much more about letting your faith be more universal. And it was just very moving for me to hear, to write, and to think with him about that during the week.
Could you say more about your own insight, or maybe what you even started writing about with letting your faith be more universal?
Well, I'm impressed that so often we deal with our faith of being correct. And it seems to me that he was saying to me, at least last week, that being loving of everyone is better than being correct. And I thought about our own denomination right now, is that we're splitting because we feel other people aren't correct. And the message seems, the message of Jesus was much more of a universal message, that being loving is more important than being correct.
I'm reminded of something that sounds even more flip, but it says, do you want to be right or do you want to be happy?
Yeah. Same thought of thought.
It's similar. And initially, when I heard that, I dismissed it and said, well, if I'm right, I want to be right. But at what cost?
Yeah.
You know, that division and kind of grumpy division about that. Yeah. Other thoughts?
It just, I also follow Read the Daily Meditation by Richard Rohr. This is ringing true. And what I've been asking myself, and it fits right in with, I think what you're saying, Kevin, is what really is resurrection? This says to me that real resurrection is laying down our rightness.
Yeah.
Because Jesus wants us to be in deep, loving relationship with anyone. Even if they say we've hurt them and we don't think we've hurt them, that we say, I'm going to lay down that part of myself and lean in and see what something new might happen in that asking forgiveness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I first started dating Becky, I made an off-color joke about women. And she said, that wasn't funny. And I said, well, it was just a joke. It was meant to be funny. I mean, that was my first lesson in realizing intent is different than impact. So what if my intent was pure? If I hurt someone, I need to own that. And I changed my behavior after that on that one. I still have many more things to learn. But you're right. We have to be listening and aware of how what we're doing and who we are is affecting other people. And when it lands badly, it's not enough to just say, oh, I didn't mean to hurt you. You can just apologize. I am sorry. My words hurt you, even though that wasn't my intent, but they hurt you, and I'm sorry for that. I'm fortunate to have been in this generation that got to learn from Richard Rohr and from many others. But each of you have had that in your own lives, and it would be, I'd love to hear if we had time sometime for you each to reflect on what were the life lessons that you learned along the way that changed the way you were going to be, you know, because you realized, oh, what I was doing as a kid I thought was great turned out not to be so great, or it might have been great as a kid, but I need to let it go now and move on to the next thing. That's spiritual maturity. Spiritual growth.
Thank you, Kevin. Great.